Chapter 1. Can I Still Play Cricket in Heaven? 1947 to 1979. Outside of Pakistan, I am mainly known for my 21-year-long cricket career. But in my home country, I am the head of a party that is battling to take on a political elite that has for more than 6 decades stymied this great country, depriving it of its God-given potential. Ruled alternately by military dictators like President Musharraf, or as a fiefdom by families like the Bhuttos and Sharifs. Pakistan has drifted far from the ideals of its founders, far from being the Islamic welfare state that was envisaged. Pakistan is a country where politics is a game of loot and plunder, and any challenger to the status quo, even somebody with my kind of public profile and popularity, can be suddenly arrested and threatened with violence. Founded as a homeland for Indian Muslims on the principle of the unifying qualities of Islam, it remains a fractured country. Kashmir, to the northeast, has been, since independence, the subject of a violent dispute between India and Pakistan, the region divided between the two. In the northwest, a civil war between the army and militants plagues the Pashtun heartlands of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and FATA, the federally administered tribal areas. Baluchistan, a vast, rugged, unexplored and thinly populated province bordering Iran and Afghanistan, simmers with a separatist insurgency. To the south, the Arabian Sea washes against the shores of Baluchistan and Sindh, where the provincial capital Karachi is riven with fighting between various ethnic groups, including Pashtun immigrants and the descendants of Muslims who came from the other side of the border at partition, referred to as Muhajirs, or refugees. Meanwhile, Punjab, home to more than half of the country's population, is resented by other provinces for monopolizing Pakistani political power and prosperity. For me, our country's woes began soon after Pakistan was created in 1947, when we lost our great leader Jinnah. Pakistan, which means land of the pure, was just 5 years old when I was born. We had such pride in our country then, such optimism. We were a new nation, wrested out of the dying British Raj as a homeland for Muslims. Gone were the insidious humiliations of colonialism and the fear of being drowned in an overwhelming Hindu majority in an independent India. We were a free people, free to rediscover an Islamic culture that had once towered over the subcontinent, free to implement the ideals of Islam based on equality and social and economic justice. A democracy, as Pakistan's founding father Muhammad Ali Jinnah said, not a theocracy. We were to be the shining example in the Muslim world of what Islam could achieve, were it allowed to flourish. Such dreams we had. It was only much later that we discovered how hard it would be to fulfill these dreams, even in a brand new nation like ours, unburdened by the rigidities of history. As the years went by, we built our own tormented history, and drifted further and further away from the ideals that had inspired Pakistan's creation. Pakistan's roots lay in the final days of the British Raj in India. Before then, the territory, roughly defined as the Punjab, the northwest frontier province, the coastline on the Arabian Sea of Sindh province and Baluchistan, had not been defined as Pakistan but, over the centuries, became first part of one empire and then another. The British, initially through the East India Company and later through the British Army, controlled the area from the early part of the 19th century onward. From the 1880s, though, the aim for millions of people throughout the subcontinent who wanted self-determination was the end of British rule. The Indian National Congress, which initially included Muslims, worked to achieve this end. The British did not want to relinquish control, but the Second World War weakened Britain economically and politically. And by then the empire on which the sun never sets was in its twilight years. The Indian National Congress negotiated with the British to bring about the end of their rule over India. And they wanted to see the whole subcontinent remain one country. Here the histories of the two nations starts to diverge, wary of Hindu nationalism, and mindful of the kind of violence that took place at sporadic intervals over the 1920s and 1930s in different cities and provinces in India. The All India Muslim League took a different view. As part of this league, two men in particular were fundamental in the foundation of Pakistan: Jinnah and Allama Muhammad Iqbal. Iqbal, who died in 1938, 9 years before the creation of Pakistan, is the visionary poet-philosopher considered to be the spiritual founder of Pakistan. In 1930, in an address to the All India Muslim League, he said, "I would like to see the Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Sindh and Baluchistan amalgamated into a single state. Self-government within the British Empire or without the British Empire. The formation of a consolidated Northwest Indian Muslim state appears to me to be the final destiny of Muslims, at least of Northwest India, believing that the Indian Muslim is entitled to full and free development on the lines of his own culture and tradition in his own Indian homelands." Iqbal felt that this was a necessary stage for the Muslim community to develop its collective selfhood, or Khudi. Iqbal not only conceived of a self-governing Muslim state. His passionate voice awakened and activated Indian Muslims, motivating them not only to strive to free themselves from the bondage of imperialism and colonialism, but also to challenge other forms of totalitarian control, believing fervently in human equality and the right of human beings to dignity, justice and freedom. Iqbal empowered the disempowered to stand up and be counted. When I was older, I found Iqbal's work hugely inspirational. He argued against an unquestioning acceptance of Western democracy as the self-governing model, and instead suggested that by following the rules of Islam a society would tend naturally towards social justice, tolerance, peace and equality. Iqbal's interpretation of Islam differs very widely from the narrow meaning that is sometimes given to it. For Iqbal, Islam is not just the name for certain beliefs and forms of worship. The difference between a Muslim and a non-Muslim is not merely a theological one, it is a difference of a fundamental attitude towards life. Iqbal considered pride in one's lineage or caste to be one of the major reasons for the downfall of Muslims. In his view, in Islam, based on the principles of equality, solidarity and freedom, there was no hierarchy or aristocracy, and the criterion for assessing the merit of human beings was taqwa, righteousness. As Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, the noblest of human beings are those who fear God most. In other words, those who are humane and just. Because when you fear God you believe you are accountable to him and must act accordingly. To Iqbal the culture of Islam did not consist of the actual cultural practices of Muslims. It was an ideal value system, based upon the ethical principles enshrined in the Quran. He believed that Islam provided the guidance needed by human beings to realize their God-given potential to the fullest. In his philosophy of Khudi, Iqbal presented his blueprint for action that would lead to intellectually sound, ethically based, and spiritually grounded development of individuals and communities. Iqbal and others, such as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, 1817–1898, who urged Muslims to obtain a Western education and established the Aligarh University for this purpose, argued that this vision of an ideal society could never be achieved as long as Muslims remained in a minority in a Hindu-dominated India. It was not only that India, with its caste system and social inequalities, was the antithesis of everything they wanted. It was also that such a bold experiment of recreating the ideals of Islam could never be achieved in a country where Muslims were in the minority. At the time, much of the Islamic world was under European colonial rule, and realizing the promise of Islam required a country, or at least a state within India where Muslims would have the opportunity to live according to the highest ethical ideals and best practices of their faith. When Iqbal died in 1938, my father was one of the many who attended his funeral. It was left to the lawyer-politician Muhammad Ali Jinnah to create that country. Iqbal was an idealist, but he offered concrete guidance to Muslims about how to live a life grounded in the integrated vision of the Quran. Jinnah also combined idealism with pragmatism, somewhat formal and fastidious, and a little aloof and imperious of manner. His calm hauteur masks a naive and eager humanity, an intuition quick and tender, a humor gay and winning, the obvious sanity and serenity of his worldly wisdom disguise a shy and splendid idealism, wrote Sarojini Naidu, the first woman to become president of the Congress Party. Jinnah had originally been a member of the Indian Congress Party and an ambassador of Hindu-Muslim understanding, committed to a united India. Yet he had fallen out with Mohandas Gandhi. When the Islamic Caliphate finally collapsed in Turkey after the First World War, it was Gandhi who led the protests for its restoration, seeing in this a way of challenging the British. Jinnah opposed the movement. He also disliked Congress leader Jawaharlal Nehru, who he felt had used his closeness to Britain's Viceroy of India, Louis Mountbatten, to outmaneuver India's Muslims in their fight for political power. Mountbatten in turn had no patience for the legal constitutional niceties put forward by Jinnah to seek special electorates to safeguard the interests of the Muslims. Mountbatten's wife, Edwina, was so close to Nehru that many Pakistanis afterwards believed they had had an affair, which turned British policy in favor of the Hindus. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Jawaharlal Nehru, Mohandas Gandhi, and Congress member Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, a Muslim leader of the Indian National Congress, who later became education minister in India's government, were four giants of the independence movement, even if they had their own idea of what freedom meant for the people of India. Even Gandhi and Jinnah, despite their differences, held views in common. Both believed that their new countries were not secular ones but ones in which religion would play an important role. Gandhi said, "Those who say religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion is," as he thought that politics without religion would be immoral, while Jinnah, some years later in a speech to the State Bank of Pakistan in 1948, reiterated that we must present to the world an economic system based on the true Islamic concept of equality of manhood and social justice. We will thereby be fulfilling our mission as Muslims. Both Jinnah and Gandhi believed that it was the compassion preached by every religion that could become a counterweight to materialism. Anti-British unity fractured after the Caliphate movement, and from the late 1920s. Political battles within the Congress led to unrealistic demands being made of the Muslim organizations. This intransigence meant that Hindu revivalists were left with the greater part of the blame for the failure to reach some form of Hindu-Muslim agreement, observed Professor Francis Robinson. Jinnah no longer believed Muslims would be safe in a united India. At a meeting of the Muslim League in Lahore in March 1, 940, Jinnah added his voice to a call for the creation of two states, one for Hindus, the other for Muslims. It is extremely difficult to appreciate why our Hindu friends fail to understand the real nature of Islam and Hinduism. They are not religions in the strict sense of the word, but are, in fact, different and distinct social orders. And it is a dream that the Hindus and Muslims can ever evolve a common nationality. He declared. The Hindus and Muslims belong to two different religious philosophies, social customs, literatures. They neither intermarry nor interdine together, and, indeed, they belong to two different civilizations, which are based mainly on conflicting ideas and conceptions. Their aspect on life and of life are different. It is quite clear that Hindus and Muslims derive their inspiration from different sources of history. They have different epics, different heroes, and different episodes. Very often the hero of one is a foe of the other, and likewise, their victories and defeats overlap. To yoke together two such nations under a single state, one as a numerical minority and the other as a majority, must lead to growing discontent and final destruction of any fabric that may be so built for the government of such a state. At this time, democracy was still evolving in the world, and people did not believe that it could accommodate different religions and ethnic groups. In what is known as the Lahore Resolution, the meeting rejected the concept of a united India on the grounds of growing intercommunal violence, and demanded that the areas in which the Muslims are numerically in majority, as in the northwestern and eastern zones of India, should be grouped to constitute independent states in which the constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign. 7 years later, Pakistan was born. Although it was, as Jinnah complained, a moth-eaten state with far less territory than its supporters had envisaged. It was created in two wings, West and East Pakistan, separated by 1.000 miles of Indian territory. The great provinces of Punjab and Bengal had been split apart, and at least 1 million people died in the tide of migration as Muslims moved into Pakistan, and Hindus and Sikhs fled to India. I had an uncle in the Pakistani army who was protecting the Punjab border crossing at the time. He always said that the bloodshed he saw during those 6 weeks was worse than anything he had seen in 4 years of fighting against the Japanese on the Burmese front in the Second World War. He was appalled by the butchery, from which not even women or children were spared. Estimates of the numbers who died range from 200,000 to over 1 million. More than 12 million were made homeless by the act of partition and had to travel long distances to settle in new parts of the country. And vast refugee camps sprang up as a result. Families and communities were devastated, as those widowed and orphaned in the slaughter had to take what was left of their belongings on a voyage to a new part of the country, where they would be unknown and, often, unwanted. Margaret Bourke-White, the American photographer and the first female war correspondent, called partition a massive exercise in human misery. The experience for individuals, in the accounts I heard and read, was heartbreaking. A 16-year-old boy joined the Pakistani army and was based on the border. There were atrocities committed by all sides, Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims. I saw people arriving on the trains that had been mutilated, women who had been raped, and children who had been traumatized. I remember thinking at the time, is this what freedom means? I had 3 uncles who lived in Simla at the time. Amid the chaos, we had lost contact with them. We never found them. Amid the horror there were often stories of Muslims concealed from their would-be attackers by their Hindu neighbors. Or the same tale but told by Hindu survivors. One such, from Yahang in West Punjab, remembered Mr. Qureshi, who helped several Hindu families reach the border, only to be murdered as a non-believer by his fellow Muslims for having saved them. The madness that took place was exactly that, a madness. No one anticipated or dreamt that such things would happen. And certainly no one expected the violence to reach such heights. Was it a reaction to the end of British rule? A release of pent-up frustrations after the decades of humiliation? It suited the British for there to be division between the peoples of India, and they actively fostered this. As an incoming viceroy, the Earl of Elgin was informed in 1861, "We have maintained our power in India by playing off one party against the other, and we must continue to do so." The haste with which the plan for partition was implemented certainly contributed towards the hostile atmosphere that created such mayhem. And the British were very much responsible for setting this timetable. However, the Muslim political leaders, virtually against all odds and in the face of intense opposition from India's dominant Congress Party, had achieved the impossible. They had created a new country. Though we were in dire straits in the early years, the revolutionary zeal that gave birth to Pakistan carried us through. Democracy, though never had an opportunity to flourish in Pakistan, as Jinnah died in September 1, 948, leaving us rudderless in an era dominated by the great superpowers of the USA and the Soviet Union. Pakistan sided with the US. But even this was to prove troublesome. Our first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, died in 1951. Assassinated in Rawalpindi, in the same park where many years later in 2007 former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto would also be killed. He was killed by an Afghan opposed to the settlement that had left Kashmir divided. A man who felt Pakistan should be fighting to take it back. Many at the time saw more sinister signs in his murder. Amid rumors of American pressure on Pakistan in relation to the access to Soviet airspace Pakistan could provide, the relationship Pakistan has had with America as a nation, although not perhaps with its government, since then has never been a satisfactory one. And after September 11 it only worsened, but more of that later. While India spent the early years of its independence with the stability provided by its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who remained in office until his death in 1964, we began a slow slide into alternating military and civilian rule which never allowed the political institutions to mature. We had other problems too. In part because of the division between the Pakistani elite and the masses. The idea of Pakistan had been conceived within a united India, and found its major intellectual wellspring in what is today the northern Indian province of Uttar Pradesh. The epicentre of the Pakistan movement was in areas that did not eventually become part of Pakistan. Later various ethnic groups, from the Bengalis of East Pakistan to the Baluch in the deserts running into Iran, to the Pashtun in the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan, would find reasons to rebel against the state, often with disastrous consequences. Since Pakistan, and especially its army, was dominated by Punjabis, these different ethnic groups felt they were denied both their economic and democratic rights, and sooner or later all took up arms against the state. We also began our life as a country at war, fighting India over the Territory of Kashmir in 1947-1948. And the festering dispute since then has helped give the army, and by default the majority Punjab element within it, a disproportionately powerful role in Pakistan. Yet in the optimism and fervour of those early years, I believe, we might have overcome all those difficulties had we been able to find a political system capable of implementing the egalitarian, democratic and ethical ideals of Islam that had inspired the creation of Pakistan. Instead, the British-trained bureaucrats had a low opinion of democracy, at least as far as Pakistan was concerned. They had been educated in a system that had taught them to look upon the masses with contempt and, copying the former colonial rulers, had inherited a mindset that the natives were not to be trusted. Without leaders with the vision of Iqbal, or the stature of Jinnah, or for that matter of Nehru, whose long tenure helped bed down Indian democracy, we were condemned to slide back into the kind of discreet authoritarian rule which marked the British Raj. At the first opportunity, the military-civilian bureaucracy stalled the democratic process. Pakistan did not come up with a full constitution until 1956. Because the West Pakistan ruling elite did not want to give the Bengalis an equal share in power, given that the population of East Pakistan was larger than that of West Pakistan, to deprive the latter of their right to an equal share. Experiments like the one-unit system, where the whole of West Pakistan was treated as one province, were introduced. This helped sow the seeds of Bengali resentment, and eventually led to the breakup of the country. The 1956 constitution was abrogated by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, General Ayub Khan, who took over the country in 1958 and announced a presidential form of government. He remained in power for 10 years before he was forced to resign amid popular unrest and was replaced by another military man, General Yahya Khan. Under Ayub Khan, Pakistan developed and changed. He introduced the Muslim family laws, which modernized some aspects of laws regarding marriage, but his efforts in agriculture and industry benefited the few, not the many. More importantly, he did not believe in democracy, so politically the country stagnated. Discontent in East Pakistan began to grow as the Bengali people, politically and economically excluded, had insignificant representation within the ruling elite. The creation of Bangladesh in 1971 was a direct consequence of this prolonged military rule, along with the reluctance of the ruling classes of West Pakistan to treat East Pakistan as an equal. Paradoxically, economically the country passed through a golden period. Our growth rate was the highest in our history, though the majority of the population was excluded from the fruits of this economic boom. Administratively the country was well run, along with contempt for the natives. The British had also bequeathed us a reasonably efficient bureaucracy. From my vantage point as a child in Lahore, and indeed as I have been told later by my parents, the optimism which had accompanied the birth of Pakistan survived and even flourished in this early period of military rule. It helped of course that we were living in Punjab, the most powerful province in Pakistan, where we had little reason to suspect the many dangerous undercurrents building up in our country. Pakistan was 5 years old when I was born. As a child in a comfortably off family in Lahore, I felt only the quiet optimism of a country hopeful for its future. It was an idyllic childhood, with the freedom of plenty of space in which to play and the security provided by the Pakistani extended family system. In Zaman Park, where I grew up, we were surrounded by plowed fields and open spaces. There were few houses and everyone who lived there was family, so it was more like being on a farm. The first House in Zaman Park had been built by my maternal grandfather's brother, whose name was Ahmed Zaman. At partition in 1947 my grandfather's family also moved there. In the hot summer afternoons I would go out with my air gun to shoot pigeons or to swim in the canal, and in the evenings play cricket with my cousins. There was no such thing as organizing play dates. I would be out till dark, my mother did not worry. She always knew I was with family. For fresh milk every house had a cow or a water buffalo. Today, Zaman Park is in the center of Lahore, so fast has the city spread in every direction. All that is left of those green and open fields of my childhood is a small park. There are so many houses that people do not know each other as they once did. Although boys still swim in the canal, it is now dirty and polluted. Lahore's water, which used to be delicious, has become so contaminated it has to be boiled before drinking. I used to go to a school friend's farm that was barely 10 miles out of Lahore. And there at the age of 14 I used a shotgun for the first time and bagged 14 partridges. It was the most thrilling thing I had ever done. My friend's farm is now part of a suburb of Lahore and has been transformed from a place of wildlife and green fields into a concrete jungle. Today in the entire province of Punjab there are probably only a handful of reserved areas where one gun can shoot 14 partridges. My mother would make us children go to see our maternal grandmother with our cousins every day for half an hour. These evenings with her were most enjoyable. She would know everything that was going on in our lives. In fact, she would get involved in all our problems and we would tell her things that even our parents would not know. The love that my grandmother received from all her children and grandchildren must have been the reason why all her mental faculties were fully intact when she died at the age of 100. She might have lived longer, but when my mother died in 1985 she simply could not get over the loss, my mother being her youngest child. It almost seemed as if she decided it was time for her to go. She refused to get out of bed and 3 months after my mother's death she passed away. In Pakistan, family is everything. Islam strengthens the family system by making the role of the mother sacred. In the words of the Holy Prophet, Pbuh, paradise lies under the feet of the mother. And the greatest influence on my life was my mother. There were 5 of us and I was the only son. She was a complete mother, happy to sacrifice all her pleasures for her family. I remember I would hide injuries from her just so as not to pain her. Once when I was 8 years old my cousins and I were raiding someone's mulberry garden. Suddenly the gardener came. While trying to jump from the tree, I slipped and fell on a branch. The sharp stick pierced a couple of inches in my thigh, almost rupturing my main artery. When I was taken home I refused to show the wound to my mother because I could not bear to see her suffer. So great was my love for her that I hated to do anything that would annoy her. This is how love imposes discipline. She would make me do my homework every day, but I was so single-minded about sport that I would be uninterested in studies. It was only her efforts that kept me going. However, apart from my homework my mother would never push me to do anything if I didn't want to do it. As its name suggests, there is a park in the middle of Zaman Park, where all us cousins, ranging from children to adults in their 20s, would play cricket and hockey. Matches would be played with such aggression that one year visiting hockey teams refused to play us. My passion for cricket, along with partridge shooting, developed thanks to my uncles and cousins. My mother's family was passionate about cricket. I was inspired to become a test cricketer at the age of 9, when I saw my older cousin Javed Burki score a century against England at what is now the Gaddafi Stadium in Lahore. I used to treat my aunts and uncles' houses as my own, as all social life revolved around the family, with my grandfather's and his brothers' houses as the focal points. At family dinners everyone would be there, from babies to the oldest members of the family. The rules of etiquette were clearly defined. Age was to be respected. The older the family member, the more respect they were accorded. When the elders spoke, all the younger members listened attentively. In turn, the elders took personal responsibility for all the children. Hence a member of the younger generation could be disciplined by any elder, not just their parents. Any rudeness to an elder meant disapproval from all the senior members of the family. Unfortunately, amongst the westernized elite in Pakistan the respect for age is diminishing. Some, who are uncritically adopting Western culture, almost consider a lack of respect for age a sign of progress. I remember how odd I found it when my tutor at Oxford asked me to call him by his first name. It was even more awkward for me when friends' parents would also insist that I did the same. Our value system was also molded by the attitudes of the elders. The younger members would carefully observe what was approved and what was condemned by the seniors. It was never the fear of being punished that made all of us follow family etiquette, but the fear of everyone's disapproval. Moral standards were high because immorality would have meant being ostracized. The greatest fear was to give a bad name to the family. Everything depended upon the reputation of a family, from arranged marriages to social acceptability. Any slight by an outsider on the character of a family member would mean an immediate closing of ranks by a united family front. It also put immense responsibility on family members to conform to certain moral and ethical standards. When I became a successful Test cricketer and gave interviews to the press, I would be extremely conscious of what I was saying, as I constantly worried about how my extended family would react to my comments. Like most Muslim children, I grew up with religion. My mother used to tell us bedtime stories, each one with a moral message, about Moses and the arrogant Pharaoh, Joseph and his treacherous brothers, and of course about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, pbuh. We were also taught about Jesus, considered in Islam to be a messenger of God like Muhammad, pbuh. Muslims believe that God had previously revealed his message for mankind to the prophets of the Jews and Christians, but that Muhammad, pbuh, perfected the religion first revealed to Abraham. Muhammad, pbuh, is seen as the seal of the prophecy, the last in the series of prophets God sent to the world. Islam recognizes the teachings of the Jewish Torah and the Christian Bible. And while it teaches that Jews and Christians have in some areas strayed from the true path, it acknowledges them as people of the book. Every night before going to sleep, my mother would make us say our prayers and tell me stories about the Prophet. Pbuh. There was one particular story my mother would tell me. An old Meccan came before the Prophet, pbuh, and said to him, "The only reason I want to become a Muslim is because all my clan has converted to Islam. But I am too old to change my habits. Tell me one thing I can do so that I can become a Muslim but keep my habits." The Prophet, pbuh, replied, "Tell the truth. That is the one thing you need to be a Muslim." This story appealed to me as a boy, because I too found the rituals to be cumbersome. Besides, I could never lie to my mother, as she would always catch me out simply by looking at my face. My mother also told me how her father, Ahmed Hassan Khan, modeled himself on the Prophet, pbuh. and would tell me stories about how, whatever he did, he would always tell us this is what the Prophet, Pbuh, did, even to the point of liking honey and dates. The concept of heaven and hell was made clear to me ever since I can remember. The only problem was that I could not understand heaven. My poor mother frequently had to answer questions like, would I be able to play cricket in heaven? And would I be able to shoot? When I was 7 years old, a Maulvi, Islamic scholar, came to teach me and my sisters the Quran in Arabic. In school we had a religious knowledge class and our daily assembly started with a verse of the Quran. Every Friday I went with my father to the mosque. On Eids, the two biggest festivals of the Muslim calendar, all the males of Zaman Park, young and old, would go to the shrine of the great 16th century Sufi Saint Mian Mir Sahib. Mian Mir is also a legendary figure for Sikhs who come to pray at his shrine in Lahore. Our family graveyard is outside the shrine, so after Eid prayers, we would go to our relatives' graves and pray for their departed souls. Such shrines are common in the subcontinent, where Islam was spread from the 9th century onwards in large part through the Sufis. Their egalitarian message and doctrine of love, peace and compassion appealed to the poor and dispossessed. The Sufis' tolerance of other religions and cultures meant that as they made their way through what became the Islamic world, the religion they spread blended with local customs to become a kind of populist Islam. Their followers made shrines of their graves, which became places of pilgrimage. Rich and poor alike still flock to these shrines to pray and make offerings. Once a year, usually on the anniversary of the saint's death, there is an urs, a festival, when prayers are accompanied by devotional dancing and singing and the distribution of food. This is the kind of Islam that the austere Wahhabi branch, which has influenced the Taliban, opposes. My parents were both easygoing Muslims who always taught us that Allah was the most beneficent and the most merciful. We were never forced to read our prayers or fast. At Ramadan, the month when Muslims fast from sunrise to sunset, it was we children who would choose to compete with each other to keep our fasts. I kept my first fast around the age of 9 and was rewarded with presents from my father and mother. If there was anything said against Islam, both my parents would defend it vigorously. My mother's extended family was originally from the Burki Pushtun tribe in Kanaguram, the biggest town in South Waziristan, which rests in a fertile valley close to the Afghan border in the tribal areas. She instilled in me a pride that the Pashtuns had never been subjugated and had constantly fought the British. Her family had ended up living in 12 fortresses, known as Busti Pathan, near the town of Jalandhar, where she took much pride in saying my grandfather had hosted Jinnah, southeast of Amritsar, only 40 miles or so away from Lahore but in what became India. The whole family had emigrated to Lahore at partition, although none of them had been killed. When they moved out in a convoy, the Sikh gangs who were massacring the Muslims in Punjab believed, wrongly, that they were armed, and left them alone. My father's family were also Pashtuns, also known as Pathans, but from the Niza tribe, which had come to India with invading Afghan tribes around the 15th century. Much of his family still lived in Mianwali, a town on the river Indus on the border with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, formerly known as the Northwest Frontier, and family ties are still very strong there. In time amongst the Burkis, my mother's tribe, the family system will begin to weaken, and my children will only know their first cousins, but in Mianwali even third cousins know each other. I frequently meet Nizis who will tell me how they are related to me through my great-grandfather. Village. Communities have stronger family systems than urban ones. In a place like Myanmar, people often operate as part of a family group of maybe 100 people. There is a network of siblings and first, second, and third cousins. Everything is shared: salaries, responsibilities, friendships, enemies, hardships and successes. When people from rural areas go to look for jobs in the cities, the first people they contact are their relatives. If there are none, then they seek out people from their village or tribe. Millions of people have been displaced by fighting or floods in recent years, but you do not see hordes of hungry, homeless people sleeping on the streets of Pakistani cities. Many have been absorbed by the family and tribal network. People with little have taken in, fed, clothed and housed people with still less than them. All this of course helps free the country's rulers and elite from bearing the burden of so many displaced people, let alone the responsibility of paying taxes and implementing any kind of effective welfare system. As I have so often observed in Pakistan, the poor have taken the blow for the rich. Growing up in Lahore, I became aware of two strong prejudices. One was against colonialism. This, according to my mother and father, was the ultimate humiliation for a people. At bedtime, my mother would tell me stories of resistance to the British, about heroes like Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, who died defending his city when he was attacked by three armies, the British, the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Marathas, in 1805. At the same time, she would contemptuously relate the story of the surrender of the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, who died in 1862 in captivity in Burma. She would quote the Tipu Sultan's remark, "The day of a lion is better than 1,000 of a jackal." The general thinking in the Indian subcontinent is that the greatest damage inflicted by colonialism was material. There is no doubt the subcontinent did suffer in such a way. In the 1700s the CDP of India was almost 25% of the world's economy. By the time the British left it was around 2%. The British lawyer Cornelius Walford estimated in 1879 that there had been 34 famines in the previous century or so of British rule, but only 17 in the preceding 2,000 years. M. Akbar writes, the Mughal response to famine had been good governance, embargo on food export, anti-speculation regulation, tax relief and free kitchens. If any merchant shortchanged a peasant during a famine, the punishment was an equivalent weight in flesh from his body. That kept hoarding down. Millions died in these catastrophes. A materialist lobby feels that British rule gave India a strong administrative system along with an infrastructure of roads and railways. Up to a point. This is true as well. In my opinion, the greatest damage done to the people of the Indian subcontinent was in the humiliation of slavery and the consequent loss of self-esteem. The inferiority complex that is ingrained in a conquered nation results in its imitation of some of the worst aspects of the conquerors, while at the same time neglecting its own great traditions. It destroys originality as the occupied people strive only to imitate the occupiers. Furthermore, this slavish mimicry wrecks any sense of leadership in the elite, the people with the most expensive education in the country. One of Iqbal's great qualities was that he provided such new and original thought. Despite having lived his entire life under colonial rule. In a well-known verse he told his son, "My way is not one of being wealthy but of fakiri spiritual poverty. Your khudi selfhood do not sell. In poverty make a name." The legacy of colonialism led to our other prejudice against India. We as a nation Felt we had been cheated out of Kashmir by the pro-Indian last Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Hatred against our neighbor, in Punjab especially, reached its height in the 1950s and 1960s, since so many Muslims had migrated from East Punjab at partition in 1947, and hardly a family had not lost loved ones in the bloody massacres during the border crossing. It was only later, when I toured India playing cricket, that I realized how much we have in common and lost this prejudice. Islam, we were told, was tolerant, and it had spread in the subcontinent not by the force of arms but by the great Sufi saints, such as Khwaja Muinuddin Kishti, known as Gharib Nawaz, the benefactor of the poor, who lived in North India in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, who won people over with their humanitarian message. Sufis were held in such esteem that, in 1303, when a Mongol army under Targi laid siege to Delhi, Sultan Alauddin Khilji appealed to the great Sufi saint Nazam-ud-Din Aulia for help. Since both my parents had Hindu and Sikh friends from school and college before independence, we were never taught to hate people from other religions. There was no militant fundamentalism in those days, and those few who could be classified as religious bigots were not taken seriously. We were told, however, that Islam was the superior religion since the Quran had been dictated to the Prophet, Pbuh, by God himself, whereas the other holy books had been written by man, and so human faults had slipped in. Muhammad, Pbuh, was unlettered. He therefore had to ask other people to write down the messages he had received from God. Apart from being a book of wisdom, the Quran is still considered the greatest work of Arabic literature, and the beauty of its words has converted many, including the great Caliph Umar, one of the Meccans most opposed to the new religion being preached by Muhammad, Pbuh. Umar was at the forefront of plans to assassinate the Prophet, Pbuh. But according to Muslim tradition, when he heard his sister recite from the book, his heart softened. He wept and Islam entered into him. He went on to become one of Muhammad's, Pbuh, main companions, inheriting leadership of the Muslims after his death. The only time I truly understood what the Caliph might have experienced was when I took my sons once to the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad for Friday prayers. A visiting imam from Egypt was delivering the khutbah, the sermon. Often you sit there during the sermon and become lost in your own thoughts because you cannot understand the Arabic. But when the imam started reciting, I was immediately struck by the sound that gently filled the whole mosque. Looking around, I saw that as his voice resounded through the building, it was having the same effect on other worshippers. It was like listening to a classical symphony. It gave me goosebumps. I have never heard anything like it before or since. Not even in the two great mosques of the holy cities of Mecca or Medina. Islam is not just a religion to be practiced privately by individuals, but a way of life. The Quran lays out clear rules for how a society should be governed, and guidance on how people should behave. I was taught it was also a forgiving religion that laid special emphasis on justice and compassion. There were many challenges, most of all the incendiary issue of Kashmir. In 1965, when I was just 13, war broke out for the second time since independence. I will never forget this period. Late one evening we started hearing the sound of bombardment, and the windows began to shake. From our rooftop we caught sight of the flashes of explosions along the border. I remember the anxious faces of my parents. As the bombardment continued all night, the Indian army was advancing towards Lahore. There were rumors that Indian paratroopers might land in the city, and patriotic fever gripped the country. The elders of Zaman Park were called to my uncle's house for a kind of council of war. It was decided that my older cousins should group together in a civil defense force to defend Zaman Park. I was itching to be part of this force and, armed with the .22 rifle that my father had just given me for my birthday, I marched out to join them, only to be sent back and told I was too young. I cursed myself for not being old enough to join in. Along with my mother and sisters, I was sent away from the city for my safety. As we approached Pindai, I remember seeing open areas outside the city swarming with warriors from the tribal areas volunteering to assist the army. Later I found out that my overzealous cousins almost ambushed, shot and killed two innocent people, mistaking them for Indian paratroopers. Everyone in the country was united in a desire to defeat the enemy. I don't think Pakistan had ever witnessed such unity. The nearest thing to it was perhaps when we won the World Cup in 1992. As I grew up, I developed a passion not only for my country but also for the Pakistani countryside. Every summer I would go with my parents and sisters to the hill stations to escape the oppressive heat of Punjab. I can still remember the thrill I felt as the car slowly ascended the mountain road and the air cooled. Only those who have experienced the intense heat of the Punjab summer can understand such relief. There was no air conditioning in those days. We had picnics and walks in the forest. Saw monkeys, jackals, porcupines and a huge variety of birds. Occasionally we even saw the tracks of a leopard. Once, when I was about 5 years old, during a trip to the hill station Dungakali, over 200 miles to the northwest of Lahore, a leopard killed a donkey right outside our rest house in the middle of the night. I can still recall how fascinated I was by the poor donkey's partially eaten corpse. In the winter I went partridge shooting with my uncle and male cousins in the Salt Range, a low mountain range about 2.5 hours drive west of Lahore. Some of my best childhood memories are of these trips. We stayed in colonial rest houses in the wilderness, ate sumptuous picnic lunches and returned in the evening to relax around a log fire. The Salt Range used to be teeming with wildlife: wolves, leopards, hyenas, jackals, foxes, deer, and wild sheep. There are fewer animals now, but the Salt Range remains my favorite place for shooting partridge because of its beautiful weather in the winter and hilly terrain. My mother also loved wildlife and the mountains, and she fueled my passion by telling me stories from her childhood. Some were set in the Indian hill stations of Simla, the summer capital of the British Raj, and the beautiful Himalayan station of Dalhousie, where she would holiday with her parents. Like most small boys, I was intrigued by the more grisly tales. I particularly liked the one about how her dog was taken by a leopard while her father was posted at Skasser in the Salt Range. I also loved the family legend on my father's side about how my great-uncle from Mianwali, a policeman, had fought with a leopard that had been terrorizing the local villagers and killed it with the bayonet of his gun, then spent 6 months in hospital from the mauling he received. He was given the highest award the police could bestow. The 1965 war over Kashmir ended in 17 days, but it left the military dictator President Ayub Khan in a vulnerable state, allowing room for democratic developments as his grip on power slipped, leading to the rise of a new political party, the Pakistan People's Party, PPP, under its leader Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Bhutto had studied at university in California and Oxford before he became a lawyer in London. And he represented Pakistan at the United Nations before being appointed the country's foreign minister in 1962 when he was only 34. After the war he fell out with the president and left government to form the PPP. Bhutto, like so many who come to power in Pakistan, was seen at first as someone who could lead us back to democracy. But later was to prove the opposite. Here was a man who understood history, one with an exceptional mind, highly educated and charismatic. Bhutto could have changed Pakistan completely. He was a true Pakistani nationalist. He formed the first national grassroots political party in Pakistan. However, he had a fatal flaw in his character that undermined all that he could have achieved. His feudal mindset couldn't tolerate dissent, and as a result his government became known for its brutality in victimizing opponents. But his ideas, which he expressed in his 1967 book The Myth of Independence, carried great weight, and still do. It is a great shame that he himself could not live up to all of his words. He called the story of all the civilizations of the world, from ancient Egypt to the British and French empires, the story of greed urging domination and colliding with the struggle for equality. And he noted that domination has been justified as the survival of the fittest. It has been given the name of the white man's burden. Today that ancient struggle has been epitomized in the creed of democracy against dictatorship. And most presciently he remarked that 20 years of independence have revealed to the people of Pakistan and India the sharp difference that really exists between independence and sovereign equality. This was the beginning of neocolonialism. It no longer became necessary to control the destinies of smaller countries by any jurisdiction over their territories. The British had developed neocolonialism in India in the previous century, in the princely states, of which there were well over 500, where they didn't have to rule directly as they had puppet rulers to do their bidding. Today in Pakistan, with drone attacks and raids in our cities, our sovereignty is compromised by those who are puppets of the US and have followed US diktats against the interests of the people of Pakistan. It is this aspect of neocolonialism that is breeding extremism in Pakistan today. Back then I was still young, a teenager, and in the late 1960s I trekked in the Karakoram, the mountain range spanning the borders between Pakistan, India and China. Some of my favorite holidays have been spent there. It is one of the best places for trekking in the world, with the greatest number of peaks over 24,000 feet, 7,300 meters, including K2, the second highest mountain on Earth. It really is the roof of the world. I have never seen such natural beauty anywhere in the world as in the Domal Valley at 9,000 feet, where the army holds its skiing competitions in the winter. The valley floor was covered in red and white flowers and crossed by a crystal clear stream. It seemed to be the picture of paradise, and every morning I was there I had to tell myself I wasn't dreaming. The people in this area of Pakistan were warm and friendly, untainted by tourism. On one trip one of our two jeeps broke down on the Karakoram highway. A young man passing by offered to take us to his village for the night. We zigzagged up a dirt track for about 40 minutes before ending up in a tiny village on the edge of an emerald-colored lake and surrounded by thick pine forest. The villagers served us delicious food, including the best mushrooms I have ever tasted. There was a full moon, and we sat all night by the lake listening to the wind blowing through the pines. Pakistan's northern areas are almost twice the size of Switzerland. Who knows how many such idyllic places still exist there? We came across similar hospitality in Hunza, a Stunningly beautiful valley, supposedly the inspiration behind the mythical land of Shangri-La. When I first went there in 1967, locals untouched by materialism greeted us with apricots and peaches, inviting us to stay in their houses. Amongst the endangered species to be found in the Karakoram is the secretive snow leopard with its distinctive gray-green eyes, and I remember seeing snow leopard cubs found by a shepherd and presented as a gift for the Mir of Nagar, the ruler of what was until 1974 still a princely state located in the north of Gilgit-Baltistan, the most northerly point of Pakistan. Hunza used to be so remote it could only be reached via a terrifying journey up hairpin bends overlooking thousand-foot drops in old Willa Second World War jeeps. Every so often, if you dared to look down, you would see the wreckage of a jeep that hadn't made it. Then came the Karakoram Highway, sometimes known as the ninth wonder of the world because of its elevation, the highest in the world for a paved road, and because of the sheer difficulty of building it. It took the Pakistanis and the Chinese 20 years to finish and cost the lives of almost 900 construction workers. The Karakoram is still by far the most beautiful mountain wilderness in the world, and the people are still friendly, but progress has taken its toll. Population explosion, massive deforestation by the timber mafia, and package tours are quietly threatening this paradise. Sadly, the modern world has brought unwelcome changes to many parts of Pakistan. Among those changes is the rapid increase in the population, which has grown from 40 million in 1947 to 180 million by 2011. The beauty and wilderness of our country is fast disappearing. But it was already evident in the 1950s and 1960s that this is only one of the problems that would bedevil Pakistan. These problems began in the very fabric of the state itself, born out of our slavish adherence to the traditions and institutions of the departing British. Far from shaking off colonialism, our ruling elite slipped into its shoes. The more a Pakistani aped the British, the higher up the social ladder he was considered to be. In the Gymkhana and the Punjab Club in Lahore, Pakistanis pretended to be English. Everyone spoke English, including the waiters, the men dressed in suits. We, the members' children, watched English films while the grown-ups danced to Western music on a Saturday night. Indeed, some Pakistanis even spoke Urdu with an English accent and ate curry and chapatis with a fork rather than with their hands, while a native had to struggle to get membership of these clubs. Any European could simply walk in, the waiters would not dare question whether he was a member or not. The Sindh Club in Karachi, the ultimate refuge of the self-loathing brown Sahib, did not allow itself to be contaminated with any native Pakistani symbols. Established by the British in 1871, it resisted even Pakistani national dress, banning it. Until 1974, the small westernized elite, comprised mainly of civilian bureaucrats and military men, also inherited the colonial contempt for the natives. Far from trying to implement Iqbal's vision, they took advantage of a colonial system meant to control the people. All the colonial institutions were left intact, and as a result the only change for ordinary Pakistanis was that they had a new set of rulers, the brown Sahib instead of the Gora, white, Sahib. Often these people were even more arrogant in dealing with the masses than the colonialists. Just as slave foremen were sometimes more brutal to the slaves than their masters were. A practice that continues to this day, as we'll see in Chapter 8. With the way Pakistani security forces acted in their treatment of Afghans. Almost all the bureaucrats came from the elite English language schools built by the British and modelled on their own public schools. When my father returned after doing his postgraduate degree at Imperial College, London in 1948, he was only the second person from his hometown to have become an England returned, and almost the entire town came to greet him at the railway station. An England returned would find his social status rise dramatically, and he could have his marriage arranged to a girl well above the status of his family. Then, as even now, marriage advertisements in India often state a preference for a girl with fair or wheatish complexion. Centuries of invasions from the northwest meant that the ruling classes were often fairer than those ruled, leaving an ingrained color consciousness on the Indian psyche. An England returned would automatically become a VIP in Zaman Park. When any of my older cousins came back after studying at an English university, we would bombard him with questions about life there. That knowledge alone gave them status. During their time in India, the British had embedded an inferiority complex amongst the natives with great care. Waiters and attendants were made to wear the clothes of Mughal army officers and the Mughal aristocracy, while the officers of the symbols of British power, the army, the police and the civil service, wore the dress of the colonials. The Mughal Empire, which covered most of the subcontinent from midway through the 16th century, had begun its decline in the early 1700s. But when the British East India Company started to establish its power in the subcontinent, halfway through the 16th century, the Mughal court still held sway culturally and politically over much of northern India, whose inhabitants, whether Hindu or Muslim, regarded its splendor and culture with awe and its emperor as the embodiment of political and religious power. For half a century many of the early colonialists aped the customs of the court. They spoke Farsi, wore the clothing of the Mughal aristocracy, gave up beef and pork and married local women, sometimes even taking several wives. The British historian William Dalrymple has done much to chronicle the change in attitudes as, between the mid-18th and the mid-19th century, the British took on and defeated all their military rivals in South Asia. With the French, the Siraj-ud-Daulah of Bengal, Tipu Sultan of Mysore, the Marathas and the Sikhs all vanquished, the British became more confident of their grip over the region, and imperial arrogance set in. Evangelical Christianity also played a major part in breeding a culture of British superiority and a determination to unseat the Mughal emperor and humiliate the once great dynasty. As Dalrymple writes in The Last Mughal, no longer were Indians seen as inheritors of a body of sublime and ancient wisdom as 18th-century luminaries, such as Sir William Jones and Warren Hastings had once believed, but instead merely poor benighted heathen, or even licentious pagans, who, it was hoped, were eagerly awaiting conversion. India had a decentralized system of education before the arrival of the British. Each village had its own school supported by revenues generated locally, while colleges and madrasas, religious schools, of higher education were run by educational trusts, or waqf boards. Waqf is an Islamic term for an endowment for a charitable purpose. When Bengal was conquered by the East India Company in 1757, it was discovered that 34% of the land generated no taxes because it was owned by various trusts, giving free education and health care. According to a survey by C.W. Leitner in 1850, some of these madrasas were of an extremely high standard, as good as Oxford and Cambridge. Thanks to the properties owned by the trusts, they could afford to pay handsome salaries to attract high-quality teachers. Leitner also surveyed the Hoshiarpur district in East Punjab, and found there was 84% literacy in the area. When the British left India it was down to 9%. The British abolished the trusts, confiscated the Waqf Fund and endowments, centralized the education system and set up elite English language schools. These were meant to create a class of Indians who, in the words of the 19th century administrator Lord Thomas Macaulay, would be Indian in blood and color but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, in intellect, to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. Behind their backs, the British used to contemptuously call these brown Sahibs baboons, later babus, the Hindi word for father, only not so in this context. The impact of the British implemented education system ran far deeper than the use of English and a love of cricket. Rather, it had been used by the British for a century to subjugate the local culture and create a ruling native elite. The British were too few to dominate India themselves and relied on the acquiescence of a layer of natives to enforce their rule, a form of collaboration which was one of the most humiliating aspects of colonialism. I went to a school very much in the English mode, Hison College, the nearest Pakistan had to Eton. Like the majority of my schoolmates, I considered myself superior to those students who went to the government-run Urdu medium schools. In the English medium schools not only were all the subjects taught in English, but everyone was required to speak in English. Boys caught speaking in Urdu during school hours were fined, despite it being the official language of Pakistan. Our Muslim society with its traditions and rituals was left behind with our families, and felt disconcertingly old-fashioned. The message of our education was that you had to copy the ways of the superior colonialists to make progress in life. We were to be transformed into cheap imitations of English public school boys. Our role models naturally became Western, whether they were sportsmen, movie idols, or pop stars. Besides, we could not help but notice that the older generation was deeply impressed by the colonials and their culture no matter how much they disliked them. It was only much later that I realized how much our education dislocated our sense of ourselves as a nation. At the time, I thought more about playing cricket on Hison's beautiful sports fields. Today our English language schools produce Desi Americans, young kids, who, though they have never been out of Pakistan, have not only perfected the American twang but all the mannerisms, including the tilt of a baseball cap, just by watching Hollywood films. While my generation's land of milk and honey was England, today's youth from the English language schools want to get to the United States and live the American dream. When Pakistan became independent, we should have rid ourselves of these English medium schools. In other post-colonial countries such as Singapore, India and Malaysia they set up one core syllabus for the whole country. In Pakistan the governments allowed this unjust system to perpetuate, and English medium schools still import the British syllabus for students studying GCSEs and A-levels. Students educated in these schools had a huge advantage over the children of the masses, since all the best jobs, especially in the prestigious civil service, went to those who spoke good English. And these brown sahibs in the ruling elite were conditioned to despise their own culture, and developed a self-loathing that stemmed from an ingrained inferiority complex. To show that one was educated, a stranger would immediately throw English words into the conversation to establish his credentials. At Hison, the more anglicized a boy was, the more he was admired. We were impressed by English history, English films, English teachers, English sports, English novels, and English clothes. We laughed at someone who could not speak English properly, but it was quite cool to speak Urdu with lots of English mixed in. We wore Western clothes and would feel awkward in Shalwar kameez except on ethnic occasions like Eid. When I joined the Lahore cricket team at the age of 16, I found that because I came from an English medium school I could barely communicate with the majority of the team as they had been to Urdu medium schools. Most of the boys would gang up and make fun of me. I felt like an outsider, with this huge educational and cultural gap between us, wider even than that found in the British class system. Their jokes, their humor, the films they liked, their views of the world were all different to mine. It was then that I began to realize how much resentment there was amongst those from Urdu schools towards those from the English ones. I also realized why, despite having the best sports facilities at Hsn, its boys could never compete with those from poor schools. The latter were much tougher and had a far greater hunger to succeed. Similarly, in hockey and squash, other sports that Pakistan has excelled in internationally, all the stars came from the Urdu schools. However, I discovered that they were quick to learn that the way up the social ladder was to acquire Western mannerisms. So most of the cricketers loved shopping for English clothes and learning the English language, preferably with an English accent. Some of the cricketers only started drinking alcohol, which was banned in 1977, because it was a Western, and hence upper class, thing to do. National dress was another marker of cultural identity sabotaged by colonialism. When I was a boy, I remember one of my uncles asking a cousin of mine, who was wearing shalwar kameez, why he was dressed like a servant. Another time I overheard a friend of my mother talking about someone being an upstart because he had only recently started wearing Western clothes. It was decades later, in the summer of 1988, when I was trekking with a couple of English friends in the Karakoram, that I became conscious of being dressed as a foreigner, while all the locals were in Pakistani clothes. It suddenly dawned upon me, here I was, a national icon, a role model who drew crowds wherever I went, and yet I was dressed like an outsider. Years later I was embarrassed by the Pashtun tribesmen on my first visit to Waziristan who resolutely insisted on speaking to me in Pashto despite the fact I did not speak much of their language. They made a point of it to emphasize their pride in their culture. It is only in the tribal area of Pakistan, where people are fiercely proud of the fact that they have never been conquered, that they feel no need to borrow from anybody else's culture. Colonialism only works if the colonizers are convinced of their superiority and the colonized of their inferiority. In contrast, the legacy of British colonialism is still strong amongst older or retired army officers and bureaucrats. The Pakistani military and bureaucracy being originally colonial constructs, there is an ingrained inferiority complex. I remember a serving lieutenant general saying to me, "But, Imran, my dear chapter, why do you insist on wearing shalwar kameez when you look so good in a suit? I am sure a lot of people who wear Western clothes in Pakistan would like to wear shalwar kameez, especially in the heat of the summer, but they just do not have the confidence." When I had an office in the cancer hospital I founded in memory of my mother, in the early 1990s, I ran the marketing department there. I noticed that most of the regular donors were from the trader class, who wore shalwar kameez, and decided the hospital marketing team should also wear Pakistani dress. A couple of months later a member of the team asked permission to revert to Western suits as he felt that the traders and other people generally did not give him the same respect if he wore Pakistani clothes. He also felt he had less confidence wearing our national clothes when he visited businessmen's offices. This complex worsened and since Musharraf's regime in the early part of the 21st century and its superficial drive for westernization. Even political candidates in Pakistan, particularly in Sindh and Punjab, also felt the pressure to wear Western dress. Many candidates have their publicity photographs taken in jacket and tie because they feel Western suits make them appear more sophisticated and more educated to the voters. Retaining the language or dress of occupiers or colonizers has not been that unusual throughout history. For instance, after Sicily won independence from the Arabs in the 11th century, Arabic remained the language of the island's courts for another 50 years. Yet in Pakistan, the cultural affinities of the English-speaking elite also distanced us from our culture and religion. While no one ever considered becoming a Christian, it was natural that most of us started considering Islam to be backward, just like our culture. After all, the masses were religious but poor. If any student prayed or talked about religion or had a beard, he was ridiculed as a traditional Islamic cleric or scholar, a Maulvi. Our Western education also laid emphasis on science, which based everything on the premise that what could not be proved did not exist. This clashed straight away with religion, which wanted us to believe in the unseen. Moreover, since in the 1960s the youth in the West were in rebellion against the older generation and against religion, we too became affected by those attitudes. By the time I finished school, I still went for Friday and Eid prayers with my father and fasted during Ramadan. Yet for me, and indeed for most of my friends, God was confined to the mosque. Our young impressionable minds were convinced by English and American films that Western culture was superior, along with its vastly superior technology. Had we had better understanding of our cultural heritage, or our religion and its history, it might have helped us to resist the lure of the West. Nor could our preachers counter this great onslaught of colonial culture, for they had no Western education and could not communicate with us in the language in which we had been taught. Our cultural separation from them reinforced in our minds the idea that Islam was backward. I can remember students laughing at preachers with poor English. Even nowadays, as the ruling elite despairs of the many young men who have turned to fundamentalist Islam, few grasp how much this great educational divide exacerbates our troubles. While they quite rightly talk about reforming the madrasas, which have sprung up in their thousands and often offer many poor families their only access to education, they rarely look at the problem from the point of view of the masses, who have little reason to feel an affinity with an elite who remain the inheritors of colonialism, representatives of an alien foreign culture. They have nothing in common with these people and see them as a kind of Trojan horse for the West trying to destroy our culture. It is through developing world elites that a more potent and permanent invasion is taking place in many countries. Physical colonialism has been replaced by cultural colonialism. The writer Titus Burckhardt describes this kind of dislocation in his book Fez, City of Islam. Burckhardt spent time in the Moroccan city in the 1930s, when he revisited it 25 years later. He observed, "At the time I first knew it, men who had spent their youth in an unaltered, traditional world were still the heads of families. For many of them the spirit that had once created the Mosque of Cordova and the Alhambra was nearer and more real than all the innovations that European rule had brought with it. Since then, however, a new generation had arisen. one which from its earliest childhood must have been blinded by the glare of European might and which, in large measure, had attended European schools and henceforth bore within it the sting of an almost insuperable contradiction. For how could there be any reconciliation between the inherited traditional life which, despite all its frugalities, carried with it the treasure of an eternal meaning, and the modern European world which, as it so palpably demonstrates, is a force oriented entirely to this world, towards possessions and enjoyments, and in every way contemptuous of the sacred? These splendid men of the now dying generation, whom I had once known, had indeed been conquered outwardly, but inwardly they remained free. The younger generation, on the other hand, had gained an outward victory when Morocco gained independence some years ago, and now ran the grave risk of succumbing inwardly. The jolt came in 1971. In the elections of 1970, the Awami League of East Pakistan, the party demanding autonomy there, had won a majority in parliament. Yet, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the leader of the Pakistan People's Party, PPP, which had won in West Pakistan, conniving with the military dictator General Yahya, deprived the Awami League of East Pakistan of the chance to form a government. The people of East Pakistan rebelled against what they saw as their disenfranchisement by the more powerful West Pakistan. Yahya Khan, the president and army commander-in-chief, sent in the army to suppress the dissent, the same army that had held the first free elections on an adult franchise in the first place. As the troops descended on East Pakistan, Bhutto returned to Karachi from Dhaka triumphantly proclaiming that Pakistan had been saved. But the result was a terrible war in which thousands of civilians died and millions of refugees poured into India's West Bengal. I was with the West Pakistani under-19 cricket team on the last flight out of East Pakistan before the army went in. As we played the East Pakistan team, we could feel the hostility towards us, not just from the crowds in Dhaka Stadium but from our sporting opponents too. The captain of the East Pakistan team, Ashraful Haq, who later became a friend of mine, told me at dinner that evening about the great antagonism felt towards West Pakistan. He told me that many like him would want to be part of Pakistan were they to be given their due rights. But as things stood, there was a strong movement for independence. I was shocked to hear this because we had no idea about the feelings of the people of East Pakistan. Thanks to total media censorship in West Pakistan, however, it had never occurred to me, or many others, that there was any chance of the country breaking apart. West Pakistan made a series of blunders which allowed India to subsequently exploit the situation. India, then led by Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi, invaded East Pakistan in support of the Bengali insurgency. Unlike the 1965 war with India, this time we were quickly defeated. Our army signed a humiliating surrender in Dhaka and the Indians took 90,000 prisoners of war. Our country was split in two and East Pakistan became the newly created Bangladesh. Indira Gandhi had achieved far more than her father had ever done in destroying Jinnah's idea of Pakistan. It was meant to be a homeland for the Muslims of the subcontinent. Now, after a bitter civil war and a crushing defeat, which still haunts our army, it had become a homeland only for West Pakistanis. A few years later, in 1974, I met up with Ashraful Haq again, and I was shocked at the number of Bengali civilians he told me had been killed in the military action. The figures listed by both sides are hard to verify, but it is possible that hundreds of thousands of civilians died in the civil war that lasted several months, and millions more fled into India seeking safety. I had previously argued with English and Indian contemporaries that this was all propaganda against the Pakistani army and Pakistan. After hearing Hack's side of the story, I vowed I would never again accept our government's propaganda at face value or ever back a military operation against our own people. My career in cricket had just started. I played my first international match for Pakistan in England in the summer of 1971, and away from the censored newspapers and the government TV channel, I was exposed to the international media. Seeing our surrender was only made worse when the massacres attributed to us were shown. The shock was greater because the government, and the military, kept telling the people that they would fight to the end. Only 24 hours before the surrender, General Niza from my tribe, the commander of the forces in East Pakistan, had defiantly given an interview on the BBC where he declared the army would fight to the last man. The surrender caused mass depression and a loss of faith in our country. Like everyone else in Pakistan, I had believed the propaganda of our state television, who had labeled the Bengali fighters as terrorists, militants, insurgents, or Indian-backed fighters, the same terminology that is used today about those fighting in Pakistan's tribal areas and Baluchistan. Then, as now, we fought the symptoms rather than addressing the root cause of the violence, our failure to address the legitimate aspirations of Pakistan's many ethnic groups. I also had the opportunity to see for myself how my country was perceived abroad. I had a rude awakening. For, without the protection of my family, I suddenly felt lonely and insecure. For the first time, I had to make an effort with people, and found it quite difficult. After the tour, I stayed back to finish my education at the Royal Grammar School in Worcester. I found it almost impossible to make friends with the British. My friendships with my cousins and a few school friends were informal and deep. We would drop in at each other's houses at all hours. And since we had grown up together, our bonds were strong and could withstand fighting and jealousy. Now I was faced with a situation where I did not know anyone, nor did I understand British culture, which was very different to the joint family system in which I had grown up. The friendships that I had in England were never as meaningful as those I had in Pakistan. Until much later. Following the completion of my A-levels in 1972, I began my studies at Oxford. It was a huge culture shock. The youth rebellion was in full swing, and the English culture we knew through our English schoolmasters, books, stories and anecdotes of my parents' generation had disappeared under a blitz of sex, drugs and rock and roll. Traditional British values, which stemmed from the Victorians' ideas on morality and had so impressed the older generation in Pakistan, were being rapidly discarded in Britain itself. Dismissed as hypocritical. Films and pop stars were advocating free sex, drugs and bad manners. It was fashionable to swear, and prudishness was dismissed as boring. The biggest attack was on religion and on God. In Pakistan, the English-speaking elite considered the mullah backward. But even they never dared publicly attack him. Most of them would follow Islamic rituals and considered themselves religious. However, in Britain, religion became a source of ridicule. Lampooned in Monty Python's Flying Circus and in the film The Life of Brian in the 1970s. As well as in television skits by Benny Hill portraying priests and nuns as sexual perverts. Our role models were Mick Jagger and David Bowie, while our intellectual thinking was defined by the then popular Marxist rejection of religion. From Darwin's theory of evolution to Nietzsche proclaiming the death of God, we were encouraged to believe religion belonged to a pre-logical stage of human development. Freud thought God was an illusion created by man to fulfill his own needs. Jung termed religion an alternative to neurosis. If there was any spirituality at university, it was that of the hippies. The only problem was it was usually drug-induced and included free sex. What little belief I had in God took a real beating in this atmosphere. At best I clung to my Muslim identity, though this had little to do with submitting to the tenets of Islam. I never drank alcohol, but that was because my boyhood hero and first cousin, Majid Khan, later to be captain of the national cricket team, was a teetotaler and I wanted to emulate him. The best way to describe my faith was no acceptance, no rejection. My Islam was reduced to rituals like attending mosque, and that too only when I was in Lahore. Similarly, fasting was also something I did if at the time I happened to be home. If there was a God, then he had nothing to do with my life outside the mosque. My mother, who by this time had become deeply spiritual, was alarmed at my lack of faith and would constantly ask me to read the Quran in the hope that it would guide me. Out of love for her, several times I tried to read it and each time gave up. It was only much later that I discovered why it made no sense to me. My first winter at Oxford made me miserable. The bleak, cold and wet, dull days really made me miss home and the weather in Lahore. There is no climate in the world better than the winter of Punjab, warm, sunny days and cold nights just right for sitting by a log fire. I would never tell my mother I was unhappy, but nevertheless, in one of my letters she must have sensed I was homesick. Immediately she wrote, asking me to come back. She told me I could always return to England at some other time to resume my studies, and if I did not want to study anymore it did not matter anyway. It was this love and support that made me grow up with such a complete sense of security. Her total belief in me gave me self-esteem, a vital characteristic for success. This was in sharp contrast to the British students, who were under great pressure to find jobs after university. Most of them had already moved out of their parents' homes. For me, as for any Pakistani, the concept of moving out was completely alien. It was unthinkable for the eldest or only son to ever leave his parents' house, as his parents were his responsibility for the rest of their lives. Perhaps it is no surprise that my best friend at Oxford was an Indian, Vikram Mehta, who came from a similar family structure to mine, and had like me been to a private, English language school. At that time, Benazir Bhutto, the daughter of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Vikram and I became good friends, not only because we were from similar subcontinental backgrounds, but because we were taking the same subjects, politics and economics. Vikram and I would visit Benazir's lodgings in Lady Margaret Hall every Sunday, when she would have an open house, serving cheese and snacks all afternoon as part of her lobbying to become president of the Oxford Union. Vikram and I had little interest in the union, but we would show support for Benazir. A friend of mine who played cricket for Oxford, Dave Furston, I discovered was the fiat mate of one Tony Blair, who later became Britain's Prime Minister. After leaving university, I would spend the winter in Pakistan and the summer playing professional cricket in England. In Pakistan I kept meeting people with a strong faith in God. The common people led their lives with God. Even though they did not always obey God's commands all the time, He featured prominently in their lives. They would sin, but they would know they were doing wrong and beg for forgiveness. Often, they had a fatalistic attitude to life whereby they accepted any disaster as the will of God. I considered this to fit in with Marx's idea of the opium of the masses. In contrast to the ubiquity of religion and mysticism in Pakistan, the only spiritual people I remember meeting in England were Andrew Wingfield Digby, a theology student who played with me at Oxford and was later to become a vicar, and, some years later, the English wicket-keeper Alan Knott. There was one incident involving Knott that struck me in particular, when we were part of a World 11 playing in Kerry Packers World Series in Australia in 1978. The team was discussing what to do with the prize money, whether to divide it up amongst the 12 of us who were sitting there or to also share it with the 6 others who were not present because they were playing elsewhere but were part of the squad of 18. We all decided that we should exclude the 6, justifying it to ourselves on the grounds that only those who had performed should be rewarded. Knott was shocked by our greed and immediately condemned us, saying we were being unfair to the others. Such was his moral authority that we all felt embarrassed and meekly consented to sharing the prize money with the entire squad. While I was adjusting to life in England, my country too was changing. Despite his own contribution to the disaster in East Pakistan, Bhutto became president in 1971. And used all of his abundant charisma to restore some of our battered national pride. For the first time in our country's history, he told the masses that they mattered. Unlike the civilian and military elite, with their English coldness, he was a popular and populist leader. As a young Pakistani at the time, I could not help but be proud when he made his famous speech over Kashmir to the UN Security Council in 1965, threatening to wage war for 1,000 years, before storming out. His standing up to the West like that just as the country was emerging from colonialism boosted our self-esteem. Yet Bhutto's great intellect and charisma could not translate into success for Pakistan. His misdirected nationalization choked the economy, and the feudal mindset that tolerated neither criticism nor opposition further damaged Pakistan's democracy. But perhaps the greatest disaster of Bhutto's years was the nationalization of the school system in 1972. An act which led to the departure of many qualified teachers without adequate teacher training programs being put in place beforehand. From then onwards our state school structure declined and generations of Pakistanis have suffered because of his policy. In the end it was apparent that Bhutto was just using the Pakistan People's Party (PPP) to further his personal ambitions, his promise of power to the people forgotten. Opposition to him grew, and in 1977 he was accused by political opponents of rigging the elections in the PPP's favor. Protests against the results of the elections were brutally crushed, and in a last attempt to regain ground and shore up support amongst the Islamic parties, Bhutto banned alcohol, nightclubs, and gambling. As protests escalated into riots, the army were called out to control the streets. Martial law was declared and the country was to remain under it for 11 years. General Zia-ul-Haq overthrew Bhutto, appointed himself president in 1978, and the following year had Bhutto hanged in a jail in Rawalpindi. I was playing cricket in Sri Lanka when I heard the news and felt an incredible sense of sadness. Even though I knew he had done wrong, I did not expect him to be executed. More upheaval was to come. The year 1979 was to prove a turning point for our country. In neighboring Iran, the Shah's westernized regime was swept aside by Imam Khomeini's Islamic Revolution. Later that year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Pakistan became a front-line state in the Cold War. Chapter 2. Revolution, 1979 to 1987. To tell the truth, I had no interest in politics in the 1970s or much of the 1980s. From the time I had left university in 1975 until 1983, I had been so single-mindedly and obsessively involved in international cricket that I had no time to think about much else. Anyone who has played professional sport would understand how it completely takes over one's life. One lives and breathes the sport. So intense is the competition and hence the focus. Over the years, I came to the conclusion that genius is being obsessed with what you are doing. So I was too absorbed to worry about the consequences of Zia's military regime, his slow reversal of Bhutto's nationalization program, or the turmoil in neighboring Iran and Afghanistan. Life continued as normal for most people. The only ones who really felt Zia's rule were his opponents. As the captain of the Pakistan cricket team, I had a good relationship with Zia. He used to call me personally when we won matches, and when, in 1987, he asked me on live television to come back out of retirement for the sake of the country. I agreed. Only after his regime ended did I realize his devastating legacy, and that, like so many of Pakistan's leaders, he was motivated purely by his desire to stay in power and was oblivious to the country's decline or the long-term consequences of his policies. Amidst the steady erosion of the country's political and social fabric, the Pakistani people drew solace from its success in cricket. During the 1970s and 1980s, our team started growing in strength to the point that we could match our former colonial masters. For teams like Pakistan, India and the West Indies, a battle to right colonial wrongs and assert our equality was played out on the cricket field every time we took on England. My friends, and two of my greatest opponents on the cricket field, Sir Vivian Richards from the West Indies and Sunil Gavaskar from India, were both examples of sportsmen who wanted to assert their equality on the cricket field against their former colonial masters. I know that the motivation of the great teams produced by the West Indies in the 1970s and 1980s was to beat the English. For Viv in particular, it was about self-esteem and self-respect. The two things that colonialism deprives the colonized of. Sport was not the only way to demonstrate post-colonial independence. I little realized how far the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 would transform the Muslim world. However, it was a watershed moment in the way the West would view the Muslim world. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan later that year, putting Pakistan in the front line of the Cold War, few of us fully grasped the extent to which that too would affect Muslim thinking in the world in general and Pakistan in particular. I had visited Iran in 1974 when I went to stay with a school friend from my time at the Royal Grammar School, Worcester in England. Seeing the economic and cultural divide of Iranian society and women in miniskirts in the bazaars of Tehran surprised me. In today's Lahore and Karachi I have seen a similar disparity, rich women going to glitzy parties in Western clothes, chauffeured by men with entirely different customs and values. But at the time I had never seen people behave in such a westernized way in a Muslim country and was shocked by their disregard for the cultural mores of the masses. I remember the look on the faces of the stall holders in the bazaars as these women in short skirts sashayed past. The Iranian Islamic Revolution a few years later was to draw heavily on the support of the Bazaris, who formed the backbone of a traditional, devout middle class in Iran that felt threatened by the Shah's attempts to impose an alien culture upon them and enraged by his role as a puppet of the West. In Pakistan, however, westernized people like me were, when we visited our ancestral villages or went into rural areas, or even the old city of Lahore, we had to respect local customs and sensitivities. The women in our family would wear the chador, a cloth covering the head and shoulders, leaving only the face exposed, or the burqa, a long garment covering the whole body. Even in Lahore my mother always covered her hair when she went shopping in the bazaar. To this day most women in Pakistan wear the traditional shalwar kameez with dupatta, headscarf. Only very recently have younger urban women started to wear jeans. The Iranian Revolution was a reaction in part to rapid westernization and secularization campaigns in Iran by Reza Shah, the ruler of Iran from 1925 until he was forced to abdicate by the Allied powers in 1941, and then his son Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The latter was a brutal autocrat seen to be beholden to the United States. After he was restored to power following a 1953 CIA-backed coup to overthrow nationalist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh had had the temerity to stand up for the rights of the Iranian people and seize the country's oil production, which had hitherto been controlled by the British government's Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Muhammad Reza Shah's sweeping social and economic changes alienated the poor, the religious, and the traditional merchant class who grew resentful of an elite enriched by the 1970s oil boom. Meanwhile, there was a growing class of rural poor who had moved to the cities in the hope of benefiting from the petrodollar-fueled economic growth but found themselves unemployed, consigned to the slums and increasingly under pressure from inflation as the economy overheated. The revolution led by Khomeini promised to return power to the people and restore religious purity to Iran. The events of 1979 in Tehran and the establishment of an Islamic State highlighted to the world the revolutionary potential of Islam and its power to threaten the established order in the Muslim world. The overthrow of a tyrant was welcomed jubilantly by ordinary people in Islamic countries, most of whom were also suffering under the anti-democratic rule of leaders they viewed as Western stooges, disconnected from the economic realities and religious faith of their people. As with the Middle East revolts in 2011, a sense of euphoria rippled across the region. The broad base and strength of a movement that had toppled such a powerful US-backed regime was also inspiring to people long resentful of colonial interference and Western hegemony. And it had been achieved through relatively peaceful means, with mass demonstrations and strikes. In Pakistan there was tremendous excitement, and I could sense this when I returned from playing cricket in England in the summer months. Since independence we had already been governed by 4 different constitutions. We had run through parliamentary democracy, Ayub Khan's presidential democracy, which was effectively a military dictatorship, economic liberalization and martial law. Yet here was Khomeini standing up to the West with a new system that was both Islamic and anti-imperialist. The political Islam of the Iranian Revolution filled the void left by the failure of Arab nationalism in the Muslim world. Socialism had been discredited and communism had never really taken off in a culture where religious faith is such an intrinsic part of life. As the Iranian slogan went, neither East nor West, Khomeini had forged a new path that owed little to either the Western powers or communist Russia. And he explicitly presented his ideology as an exportable political solution to the entire Islamic world. Consequently, the West was terrified the Muslim world had reached a new turning point. At stake were Western puppet regimes in oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, whose royal family Khomeini openly criticized. In the same way that the West turned a blind eye to corrupt regimes that claimed to safeguard the free world from the evils of communism, from then on, autocratic rulers could manipulate Western fears in order to clamp down on any political opposition in the name of fighting Islamic fundamentalism. The 9/11 attacks on the United States further reinforced this tendency. It was also at this point that the West started sending NGOs into Muslim countries to encourage secularization, often in the name of liberating our women or promoting human rights. Whenever there is unrest in an Islamic country, the old fears about Iranization or Islamization of the country in question are raised by the West. Only recently, in early 2011, this happened when the people of Egypt and Tunisia toppled their dictators. Other countries, too, faced internal dissent but dealt harshly with it. However, in Yemen and Bahrain, the actions that in Libya would lead to NATO intervention were allowed to continue as the regimes were deemed pro-Western. Zia, keen to legitimize his unconstitutional takeover of Pakistan, felt the mood created by the Iranian Revolution and responded accordingly. His predecessor, the Oxford and Berkeley educated Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, had used religion to counter his Western secular image by pandering to the religious parties. Bhutto's 1973 constitution confirmed Pakistan's identity as an Islamic republic. The teaching of Islam was made compulsory in schools and a council of Islamic ideology was set up to advise on Islamic legislation. He had declared the Ahmadi sect non-Muslims. His critics, though, only hardened their demands, campaigning for the introduction of more Islamic laws. Zia cashed in on the opposition to Bhutto from the religious parties, which equated secularism with anti-Islamism. He was prepared to go much further than Bhutto, pledging on coming to power in 1977 to make Pakistan an Islamic state. His version of the Nizam-e-Mustafa, the system of the Prophet, aimed to overhaul penal codes inherited from the British by bringing them into line with Sharia law. Emboldened by events in Iran, from 1979 he introduced still more reforms, Islamizing the economy and education system. He tried to introduce interest-free banking, imposed the automatic deduction of zakat, a proportion of one's wealth which every Muslim has to contribute annually, from bank accounts and invested in madrasas. The Hudud Ordinance imposed strict punishments for crimes, including adultery and its abuse by a corrupt police and judicial system undermined the legal status of women, especially in the lower strata of society. Zia revamped so many laws, but failed to introduce true Islamic social justice. In fact, his regime actually promoted inequality and corruption. His political use of Islam was aimed more at capturing the mood of the time. Zia also enforced Islamic rituals and promoted traditional dress codes in a bid to Islamize the country. Many years later, Musharraf attempted to overhaul Pakistan and turn it into a modern, liberal secular state by encouraging the use of English and Western dress, which he thought would westernize Pakistan. Zia's Islamization and Musharraf's enlightened moderation failed in their aims, as in such situations people follow the latest diktats, but inwardly carry on as before. Both Zia and Musharraf failed to understand that imposing outward observances will neither instill a sense of religious faith nor propel a country into the 21st century. General Zia's Islamization program received another boost with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Practically overnight he became a key Cold War ally of the Americans, who now forgot their qualms about backing a military dictator. Perhaps this was the origin of the saying that you need the support of the three S to lead Pakistan: Allah, the Army, and America. It was another example of the US's ability to pick and choose when to object to evil despots, or not, while lecturing the developing world on the universal importance of democracy and human rights. Fearful that the Soviets might push through Afghanistan to reach the Arabian Sea in the Gulf and choke off vital oil Supplies, the CIA, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, the LSI, funded, trained and armed thousands of militants to fight them. Many of these jihadis stayed on in Pakistan after the war, unwanted by their own governments. Having created these foot soldiers to do jihad against communism, the United States and its allies hunted them down as Al-Qaeda members and jihadis a decade after the Soviet withdrawal. At the time, there was a general feeling in Pakistan that the war against the Soviet occupiers was a just war and people made tremendous sacrifices. With my journalist friend Harun Rashid, I met so many young men in Peshawar who had done time in Afghanistan, guerrillas they might be called now. But they were heroes fighting against occupation. A romantic cause that drew idealists from across the Muslim world in the way the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War had attracted thousands of non-Spanish volunteers in the 1930s. They became rapidly disillusioned with the way the groups changed at the end of the war. However, unlike Musharraf after 9/11, Zia never allowed the CIA to spread its network within Pakistan. It was the LSI who trained the militant groups funded by the CIA. Jihad is a vital concept in Islam, indeed it is the most important concept in terms of an Islamic society. Jihad is about standing up to injustice and it keeps a society alive and vibrant. In Islam, there are three types of jihad. The first is the individual struggle to purify one's soul of evil influences. The second is to strive for justice through nonviolent means, and the third is the use of physical force in defense of Muslims against oppression or foreign occupation. A Muslim must stand up for justice for any human being's rights, regardless of their religion. When a society does not stand for justice, it dies. 2 million people marched against the Iraq War because they felt it was unjust. Were they Muslims, they would have called this protest jihad. After all, the Quran repeatedly points out that God loves not aggressors. And if everyone in a society stands up for justice, then their rulers have to listen. In the 1980s, the concept of jihad became glamorous because of the fight against the Soviets. Now it is a word associated with terrorism. There remains nothing wrong with the concept of jihad, a struggle for doing the good and forbidding the evil, but like all noble concepts it can be misused. For many men drawn to Afghanistan, this was a clear-cut case of helping the Afghans fighting foreign occupation. The tribal areas on the border with Afghanistan faced for the first time in their history an influx of foreign fighters gathered from the Muslim world to fight the Russians. Thousands of Saudis, Yemenis, Egyptians, Algerians, Tunisians and Iraqis flocked to Afghanistan, often passing through Pakistan. Trained by the LSI and funded by the CIA. A Saudi billionaire who had sacrificed a life of luxury to fight for the Afghan people was one who drew particular admiration. He was Osama bin Laden. My friend the lawyer Akram Sheikh remembers seeing him at a reception at the American Embassy in Islamabad in 1987. I went to a fundraising ball for the Mujahideen in 1983 at the Café Royal, a bastion of London's wealthy elite once frequented by Winston Churchill and Oscar Wilde. It was a very fashionable cause to support, with campaigners in the UK including Lord Cranborne, an old Etonian Conservative MP, and in the United States, Joanne Herring, the Texan socialite portrayed in the book and film Charlie Wilson's War. The legendary Pashtun pride, courage and lack of self-pity inspired their backers. In 1985, Ronald Reagan famously introduced members of the Mujahideen as the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers during their visit to the White House. Amongst them was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, leader of the Hezb-e Islami political party and paramilitary group, a key figure in the Afghan jihad against the Soviets and the main recipient of foreign funding for the cause. He is now waging a jihad against NATO forces in Afghanistan, who as far as he is concerned are foreign occupiers just as the Russians were. He is now wanted by the United States for participating in terrorism with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and termed by the State Department a specially designated global terrorist. Pakistani Pashtuns living along the Durand Line, which, when it was drawn up in 1893 by the British to mark the border between Afghanistan and what was then British India, had split the tribes, have always felt the repercussions of the tumultuous events in Afghanistan. About 100,000 people a month cross to and fro, the border meaningless to them. People in the tribal areas therefore felt it their duty both as Muslims and Pashtuns to join their brethren in the fight against the communist infidels. There was a flood of weapons into northwest Pakistan. Sir Olaf Carow, the last British governor of what was then the Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, described the Pashtun in the tribal areas as natural warriors with every man armed. Now the tribes had access to more sophisticated weapons. As arms went one way, heroin flowed the other. On their journey from the port of Karachi to Afghanistan, many of the weapons dispatched by the CIA disappeared into the local markets. Karachi ended up becoming one of the most violent cities in the world, while Kalashnikov culture hit Pakistan in general, and the tribal areas in particular. The trucks which were used to carry the weapons were then filled with heroin extracted from poppies cultivated in Afghanistan and the Pakistani border area, and sent back to Karachi. Pakistan became the world's largest conduit of heroin, and the number of heroin addicts in the country rocketed. By 1982 the Afghan Jihad was receiving annual aid of $600 million from the United States and another $600 million from the Gulf states. The Saudis' funding for the Afghan Jihad allowed them to promote Wahhabism, the doctrine of the dominant Islamic sect in Saudi Arabia. Over time its puritanical beliefs have influenced the tribal area's long-standing Pashtun traditions. The growing number of madrasas or religious schools also affected local religious culture. According to a report by the International Crisis Group, between 1982 and 1988 more than 1,000 new madrasas were set up. Many by radical Sunni parties, sponsored by various Arab countries, which were involved in the Afghan Jihad or were political partners of Zia. Even US aid money was used to promote jihadi culture. Textbooks were published in local languages by the University of Nebraska at Omaha in the United States to help indoctrinate young minds in the madrasas and refugee camps in the ways of holy war and hatred of the Russians. The Pakistan government should never have allowed these outside influences in to establish these groups in the country. Shia-Sunni violence especially can be dated from this point and grew dramatically in Pakistan. This sectarianism did a lot to undermine the position of the jihadi groups at the end of the Soviet occupation. 3 million Afghan refugees flooded into Pakistan, a country still ill-equipped to look after even its own people. Local living standards dropped as these huge communities of refugees competed for jobs and resources. Unlike Iran, where they were restricted to refugee camps, in Pakistan the refugees were allowed to move anywhere. I have to say, though, that the way ordinary Pakistani people shouldered the burden of such an influx of people puts to shame European countries for the fuss they make over accepting Refugees. The Afghans themselves did their best to retain order in the camps through their powerful tribal structure. Zia's 11-year rule was a time of great prosperity, but not because of any government policy. Pakistan averaged 6% growth a year in the 1980s as the Afghan war brought dollars both in aid and easy credit. Moreover, the remittances from hard-working Pakistanis abroad shot up during this period. It is estimated that between 1975 and 1990 some $40 billion came into Pakistan. Had this money been invested in health and education rather than in useless consumption and extravagance, the country would not be in its present situation, but under Zia corruption passed manageable proportions. He used the money flooding in for the war to buy off political opponents and to fund new political cronies who would support his rule. Through complete control of information, the graft within the military hierarchy was hidden. But Zia's worst legacy was that in trying to keep Bhutto's PPP out of power, he manufactured alternative political forces, strengthening both extremist groups and the military at the expense of democracy. In doing so, he also allowed his own cronies to make money through corruption. This was the period when Nawaz Sharif, twice Prime Minister of Pakistan, 1991, 93 and then 1997 to 99, after which he was forced into exile for some years, was literally manufactured as a leader. First, the iron foundry his family had started and which was lost to nationalization under Bhutto was returned to his father by Zia. Then he was allowed to build his business empire by using his position as Punjab's Minister for Finance. When he was elected Punjab's Chief Minister, he did the same. Working from the principle that every politician has a price, he dished out state resources to buy politicians and become head of a political party, Pakistan Muslim League, and later the Islamic Democratic Alliance, which had been cobbled together by Zia's LSI. According to an affidavit to the Supreme Court by the head of LSI at the time, General Durrani, Nawaz Sharif, amongst other politicians, received 3.5 million rupees from them. The generals won 985 non-party elections, propelled corruption to heights then unknown in Pakistan. Since candidates were not affiliated to parties, they had to be lured into Zia's King's Party through material incentives, like plots of state land, loans from nationalized banks, permits, and lucrative government contracts. The polls were a disaster for Pakistan, creating a culture of corruption and sowing the seeds for much trouble to come. I might have been more focused on my career at the time, but it pained me to watch the steady decline of my country from the 1970s. Spending my summers in the UK playing professional cricket enabled me constantly to compare Pakistan with a developed nation, and it was demoralizing. Whilst in the UK the institutions were stronger than the individual, in Pakistan powerful individuals abused the state infrastructure for their own ends. I know it hurt them to admit it, but often I would hear the elders in my family saying how things had worked better under the British rule of law, meritocracy, the bureaucracy, all were more efficient under the British, who on the whole had kept a tight rein on corruption. My parents' generation felt so let down by their ruling elite. They had had such hope and pride in Pakistan at its creation, but each year their frustration and disappointment grew. Some of the first generation of Pakistani politicians, like Sherbaz Khan Mazari, the son of a tribal chief from Baluchistan, and M. Asghar Khan, the first head of the Pakistan Air Force, campaigned for years to keep the flame of Jinnah and Iqbal's dream alive. Both spent time in prison or under house arrest after opposing Zia and Bhutto, and both have written about their bitter disappointment in the direction the country took. Like many others from my background, I would complain about the state of the country but would not lift a finger to do anything about it. I was from that privileged class that was not affected by the general deterioration in the country. The schools we went to had an imported syllabus, so if education for the masses stagnated, we were not touched by it. We did not have to worry if the hospitals were going downhill because we could always afford to go abroad for treatment. And if there were power breakdowns, we could buy generators. By 2011, most of Pakistan would go without electricity for 12 hours a day. If the government departments were corrupt, then it was all the easier for us to bribe them and have anything illegal we wanted done. In any case, we were always likely to have the necessary government connections to remove any stumbling blocks. If the general public suffered, well, it was bad luck for them. I was even more fortunate than the privileged class, as being a cricket star in a cricket-mad country, all doors were open to me. So I did not have to struggle for anything, and life for me could not have been easier. Although I took pride in my Muslim identity, Islamization in Pakistan did not bring me closer to my religion. In fact, it had the opposite effect. By nature, I always hated being forced to do anything, so Zia's imposition of Islamic injunctions upon us just made me want to rebel. When I saw Islam being used for political purposes, it only deepened my disillusionment. For someone like me who did not have much understanding about Islam, whenever the country's corrupt leadership professed to be devout Muslims, I felt it was Islam that was at fault, rather than the leadership. You see something similar happening nowadays, where hardliners believe that only a radical form of Islam will save the country, arguing wrongly that we need to change the way religion is practiced, rather than the way our country is run. Moreover, in the late 1970s and 1980s, the government-controlled television channel constantly had so-called religious scholars talking about Islam. Most young people would simply switch it off. But it was the hypocrisy that put most of the educated youth off Islam. People expected an Islamic state to have high moral standards. Events in Afghanistan and Iran dampened any hopes for an Islamic solution for Muslim countries still finding their way in the post-colonial world. In Afghanistan, infighting between the warlords amidst the mayhem left in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal in 1989 came as a bitter disappointment. The Afghan jihad leaders, glorified as religious warriors, now behaved like criminals, resorting to extortion and murder in their battle for personal power. So many had died, so many ordinary foot soldiers had made great sacrifices, but their leaders betrayed them. The Taliban, which as a group first rallied in order to rid the people of the chaotic tyranny of the warlords, initially gave a semblance of rule of law to the war-ravaged country. But with their unenlightened version of Islam, their inability to understand the essence of the religion, combined with aspects of the harsh rural Pashtun culture, they began to look increasingly oppressive. They refused to tolerate any other viewpoints. Somebody could be declared un-Islamic and punished for something as trivial as not having a beard. Meanwhile, the sorry descent of the Pakistani jihadi groups after the end of the war in Afghanistan into sectarianism and religious bigotry also took the shine off the religious idealism of the late 1970s and early 1980s. During the Soviet-Afghan War, both the Saudis and the Iranians had supported sectarian militant groups in Pakistan. In its wake, these groups turned on each other, unleashing Sunni versus Shia violence. For most people, this was completely against Islam, which preaches tolerance towards other creeds and faiths. Even Iran, which had aroused such expectations in the Muslim world, disillusioned those looking to Tehran for a lead on democracy Muslim style. In particular, people were nervous about the power of Iran's Guardian Council of Ruling Religious Leaders, which had the power of veto over democratic decisions. Again, this was completely contrary to the democratic message inherent in the Prophet's, Pbuh, teachings. Democratic principles were an inherent part of Islamic society during the Golden Age of Islam, from the passing of the Holy Prophet, Pbuh, and under the first four caliphs. But after the fourth caliph, Hazrat Ali, the fourth successor to Muhammad's Pbuh leadership, who ruled over his vast empire, from Egypt in the west to the Iranian highlands in the east, democracy disappeared from the Muslim world. Hereditary kingship replaced the budding democracy of the Medina state, and only in the 20th century did it make a reappearance in the Muslim world. In the 18th century, Shah Waliullah attributed the decline of the Mughal Empire in particular and Muslims in general to the institution of monarchy, which, according to him, was degenerative and bound to decay. Today in the majority of the Islamic world there are sham democracies which have not given freedom to the people, hence the urgency and anger of the revolutionary movements spreading across the Middle East in early 2011. An Islamic state has to be a democracy and a meritocracy. In an ideal Islamic society, there should be no hurdles in the way of a man achieving his God-given potential. Islamic legal discourse covers both spiritual matters and the rights of an individual in everyday life. On the one hand, it deals with prayer, worship, fasting and pilgrimage. On the other, it protects the most basic human needs and rights expected under civil law in the West, the rights to life, religion, family, freedom of thought and wealth. An Islamic state also guards against the executive accumulating too much power by emphasizing that even a ruler is not above the law. Of the first four great caliphs after Muhammad, Pbuh, two ended up in front of a judge in a court of law. Hazrat Ali himself lost a case against a Jewish citizen because the judge refused to accept the testimony of Hazrat Ali's son. In Islam, since all sovereignty belongs to Allah, both the executive and the people have to stay within the limits of His laws. The founding fathers of the American Constitution also strove to do the same by making the Constitution supreme. This is why, when Jinnah was asked in 1947 about the Constitution of Pakistan, he said its basis would be the Quran. Justice, compassion, welfare and equality, along with democracy, are at the heart of Islam. Yet we saw non-Islamic Western states having greater ethical and moral norms. When I arrived in the UK in the 1970s, it was the first time I had seen a proper welfare state. Coming from Ayub Khan's Pakistan, I was amazed by the level of social security. I felt like the Islamic scholar Muhammad Abduh, 1849 to 1905, who said on his return from a trip to Europe to his home in Egypt, "I saw no Muslims in Europe, but I saw a lot of Islam and of his homeland. There are a lot of Muslims here but no Islam." This quotation is perhaps even more relevant today, as the spirit of Sharia, Islamic law, is more visible in Western countries than in the Muslim world. Until I started educating myself about it, like the majority of Western educated people in Pakistan, I too believed Sharia to be some medieval set of laws irrelevant to our times. It conjured up images of fanaticism, women in veils, terrorism, intolerance and the abuse of human rights. Part of this stems from the prejudice in the Western media about Islam, a prejudice that dates back to the Crusades. Unfortunately, it must also be blamed on the extremely Unenlightened interpretation of Islam by certain Muslim regimes and groups. In theory, the Islamic State should be a welfare state. That is why I find it strange that in Pakistan people who stand up for Islamic values are called rightist. Islamic values actually have more in common with leftist ideologies. In terms of social equality and welfare, Hazrat Umar, the second caliph of Islam, who ruled from 634 until his death in 644, set up the first true welfare state in the history of mankind, even introducing pensions, widows, the handicapped, orphans and the unemployed were registered and paid from the state treasury. Moreover, the Quranic injunction of zakat, which exhorts Muslims to give 2.5% of their wealth to the poor and to charity, meant that it was compulsory for citizens of an Islamic state to look after the vulnerable. The idea of setting up waqf, welfare trusts, that ran orphanages, hospitals, madrasas and sarais, free accommodation for travelers, long preceded the concept of trusts in Europe. Yet today, Europe has the best social security system, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. And even the United States spends billions of dollars a year on the welfare of its people. Sadly, the vast majority of Muslim countries have no welfare system at all. The poor in Pakistan have no safety net other than their own families or tribes. They cannot afford education, health or justice. According to the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, 54% of Pakistanis face multidimensional deprivation, meaning they lack access to proper education and health facilities and a decent standard of living. Almost 2/3 of the country lives on less than $2 a day, and about 40% of Pakistani children suffer from chronic malnutrition. How can Pakistan be called an Islamic society? Returning in the winter to Pakistan after playing cricket in England through the summer, I watched the changes in my country with the nagging anxiety of someone who saw it deteriorating each time I came home. Yet I never thought of leaving. I could never imagine another home but Pakistan. Nor did it even enter my mind at this stage to enter politics. In fact, I could not think of anything worse. By the early 1980s, like most of the privileged class, I was coming to the conclusion that, since Pakistan's problems were so many and so insolvable, the best thing to do was to just look after myself. Besides, what could politics possibly give me? I had the life that many young people, in Pakistan and elsewhere, dreamt about. I was a rich and glamorous cricket star, jet-setting all over the world. Politics was considered a dirty business for those who could not do anything else. Most of the students from my school who went into politics were hopeless at both academic subjects and sports. Usually they belonged to feudal families with political ties. No one thought of politicians as selfless people who wanted to make Pakistan a better place to live in. Neither did I take much interest in social work or charity. Sure, I attended fundraising dinners every now and then, but hardly ever because I was touched by the cause of a particular charity, more because of the social occasion. I hardly ever gave zakat, feeling I had done my duty to society once I had paid my taxes. Despite this, it was around this time I began to contemplate that there could be a God. It had nothing to do with Pakistan's Islamization, but it's something to do with cricket. By 1982 I was close to my peak as a cricketer. I had been playing all year round for almost 7 years. During this time I began to observe a phenomenon that players called luck. There were times when I would be in great form yet would not have much success, whereas at other times I would be feeling lousy and yet do well. I also found that in closely fought contests there was usually one point that would tilt the contest in favor of one team. Sometimes this would have nothing to do with playing ability. For instance, many times during my cricketing career an umpiring mistake or bias had cost one team the match, even the series. There were other times when a contest was being won by a team and some non-cricketing phenomenon like rain would tilt the game in the other team's favor. The toss of a coin also sometimes made the difference between winning and losing. And a peculiar phenomenon which only pace bowlers would appreciate is that sometimes a ball just does not do anything, no matter how helpful the conditions, while at other times a ball will swing in unhelpful conditions. This was because of the way it was stitched together. Then of course a ball could become soft or out of shape and would not respond to the most skillful bowler, again influencing the outcome of the match. On several occasions I would also observe that a batsman would play as if he had a charmed life and was destined to score runs on that particular occasion. He would make mistakes, take unnecessary risks, invite catches, look as if he was about to be got out any second, but end up making runs and being successful. I began to realize that in sports, no matter how good I was or how hard I tried, success was never guaranteed. It is important to stress, however, that players who had ability, guts, diligence, and determination were consistently successful. But there seemed to be a zone beyond which players were helpless, and it was called luck. Over the years I began to ask myself the question: could what we call luck actually be the will of God? The other thing that made me feel there could be a God was the vulnerability every sportsman feels regarding injuries. A sportsman can train for months to prepare himself for a big event, yet a slight muscle tear can result in all the hard work going down the drain. As a fast bowler I had to be in perfect muscle condition before a match. Several times I played with half injuries, not sure whether they would worsen during the match or gradually improve. This again was an area out of my control. In 1982 I was at my absolute peak as a fast bowler in terms of physical strength, experience, and skill, and was poised to go for the world record for the highest number of test wickets. I was so fit and strong that I felt nothing could stop me. This was a point in my life when I used to wonder how people could get old. I just could not imagine that I could ever lose my fitness and strength to age. I felt invincible. In 1 year I had got over 90 test wickets in just 13 tests, almost a world record. I had got there through sheer passion and hard work and never relied on anyone but myself. If I had injuries, rarely would I go to a physiotherapist, relying instead on exercise to help me recover. The Pakistan cricket team was rapidly becoming a force in international cricket. We had just thrashed Australia and India comprehensively. Just at that point I got a stress fracture in my shin bone and could not bowl for the next 2.5 years. During this time the majority of the doctors I saw felt that I would never bowl again. My whole world came crashing down. Only an athlete can understand the shock of a potentially career-ending injury. It was the most devastating thing that had happened to me in my life so far. I also lost the confidence acquired through my success in cricket. Success always creates jealousies in certain quarters, and all this came out. Now, there was a spate of nasty articles against me. A couple of players who would not have dared to cross me when I was fit took the opportunity to put the knife in, feeling that I was finished and it was safe to vent their animosity. I used to deal with such people by performing on the field and shutting them up. Now I felt defenseless and had no clue how to deal with the situation. I became a recluse and in my mind made it into a huge crisis. But with hindsight it was a storm in a teacup. Much later I read a book by the eminent cricket writer and historian David Frith about how many cricketers had committed suicide once they could no longer play cricket. Whilst I was never in danger of that, I understood their torment. Not knowing whether I would bowl again made me feel extremely unsure and insecure about my future. In such a state of mind I saw an astrologer and a couple of clairvoyants. Until then I had never believed anyone who claimed to be able to tell the future, and frankly I had never needed to. I had so much self-belief that I felt I could achieve anything through my own talent and hard work. I was never one of those sportsmen with trivial superstitions about objects or habits that would bring me luck in a match. My experience with both the astrologer and the clairvoyance was highly unsatisfactory. Most of what they said was wrong. I vowed that I would not bother with them again. In my state of uncertainty and vulnerability, despite all my doubts, I would turn to God. Especially when, on the long and painful road to recovery, I would start feeling twinges in my shin bone. Twice I had bowled too soon without waiting for the bone to heal properly, and both times the crack reappeared. The third time I was careful, but whenever I felt pain I was never sure whether I would make it or not.